Greetings. Hello from Central Florida. There was a fellow that came to Florida, and he was at the beach, and he decided he'd go to a restaurant, and he ordered something called a pelican burger. He told his friends it was good, but the bill was enormous. Hope you like that. Hope you like that story. My son Daniel and I, normally Daniel has organized services through the Flair Church, and normally the system is to read the Gospels and Acts through in a year. But this is a Shemitah year. This is a sabbatical year, and following Deuteronomy 31, what it has to say there. This year we're reading through the Pentateuch, the way the synagogues do, the portion of the week, each week, and it's divided into 7 readings. So through the week, we go through the 7 readings of that weekly portion, and then we're also doing reading of the epistles. We plan, God willing, to within about a year to finish all of the New Testament epistles. So if you're interested in that, it's out there. It's available through Flair. I also want to mention, and I'll say more about this as we get closer to the time, but I'll be giving a couple of seminars for the Common Faith Network in Lexington, Kentucky, in the 3rd week of December. So drop everything and head on down there. Well, I don't know how that's going to work. But anyway, if you're interested and able to come, I'll have more information for you over time. There's a scripture in Isaiah that I want to talk about later on, but I'm going to look at it now, and I'm getting used to using a device rather than a book. I've gone very modern now, but the purpose of the talk is going to be today. He has purposed, and so it shall stand. He has purposed. Let me get the actual quote that I want to use. As he has purposed, so it shall stand. All right. As he has purposed, so it shall stand. So as I said, today I'm using a device rather than a book, although I'm going to go to a Hebrew book later. I want to go now in this device. I want to go to the book of Romans. And Paul there talks about God's plan for the Jews. Now, he, of course, worked for the whole people of Israel, but the northern kingdom eventually, as you know, disappeared from history. I can have more to say about that at another time. But the southern kingdom survived, and so we have the Jews as God's church, to which Jesus Christ came. Then we have, of course, unfortunately, a splitting where we have the Jewish community, generally speaking, went one direction, and then the New Testament community went another. But Paul reminds Christians in Romans 11, that God has a plan for the Jewish people, and it's going to work out. He shows how it's all going to come together for the best. The plan is going to come together. It's going to work out. And finally, he finishes with just a very emotional statement here. It's next to the last verse, or well, not quite the next to the last verse, but close to the end. Pardon me, of Romans 11. Romans 11:33 reminds me of Psalm 145. And talks about. Sometimes, if you listen to Dennis Prager, he'll have to translate from Hebrew back into English. So now I'm doing that from Psalm 145. V'nifla to'in cheker, that for his wondrous work, you cannot really search it out. In Romans 11:33, Paul says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out." the way it's all going to work together. We're given an indication in the Bible of a plan of God, and we see it working through history, and we see the prophecies and the promises of how it's all going to work out. And Daniel and I, as I said, we've been going through the readings in Genesis, and we see that the patriarchs were tested. God made certain promises to them, but the promises that needed to be fulfilled at that time were fulfilled, and then the far-reaching ones were fulfilled over time, and ultimately all of them will be fulfilled. I want to go to a specific part of the Bible, a specific incident today that I want to cover, and then tie it in with this concept that God's purpose will stand. I want to go to first to the book of Hebrews, and in Hebrews the 9th chapter and the 4th verse, and here the author of Hebrews is talking about the tabernacle. Originally there was a tabernacle established as a focus of the spiritual life of the Israelites in the wilderness. God was going to be in a special way present in that tabernacle. And in verse 4, I'll read the first few verses of Hebrews 9. Then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and the earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle is prepared, the first part in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, right? The Holy of Holies. Where the priest only entered once a year on the Day of Atonement, as we know. Which had the golden censer and the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. So when it was first established, that was what the ark contained. Now we could discuss what happened historically, but the Aaron's rod that budded was there, and I want to talk about that. I want to talk about Aaron's rod that budded. What is the background of that? So I want to go now to the book of Numbers. Now it's unfortunate that when you read about the history of Israel in the wilderness, you see human nature in a way at its worst. But in 1 Corinthians 10, and I think it's verse 11, I don't necessarily have to turn to the verse. Paul says all these things happen as examples for us, who are destined to be, part of God's plan of salvation, to be part of the resurrection of the just when Jesus Christ returns. And so we need to study these examples of Israel in the wilderness so we can get a control of our nature and not make the kind of mistakes that the carnal Israelites made. We should be, of course, be people who have a converted mind if we're part of the church. So we should have an advantage over the Israel as a whole, because Israel as a whole was an unconverted people. They had a relationship with God under the Sinaitic covenant, but it was not yet the new covenant that Jeremiah, prophesied about in Jeremiah 31. And so you go through the history there, and it's rather in some ways depressing, but I mean, it's all going to work out. But in fact, eventually there was another generation that did, in fact, inherit the promised land under Joshua. But that first generation, the wilderness generation, they had been liberated from Egypt and saw all those miracles. Unfortunately, they kept spiritually stumbling. And in number 16, we have this rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. They decided, maybe they should be in charge, and various others of the Levites. Why should Moses, that particular Levite, be in charge? Why should Aaron, that particular Levite, be in charge? Why shouldn't other Levites be in charge, or even maybe from some of the other tribes? I mean, Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob. So there was this conflict over leadership, and yet God had made it quite clear, who he designated for leadership. And so we understand, if you read what happened in number 16, this rebellion was dealt with very severely. The earth swallowed up the rebels, and many others were, lost their lives at that time. It's there in number 16. And the congregation, in effect, blamed, in a way, the leadership for what happened. They still didn't get the point. This really was for their good, to show them, in fact, who the leadership, what leadership God had designated, and that they shouldn't blatantly rebel against God's will. But, they basically kind of whined over what happened, unfortunately. But anyway, in number 17, God said, I'm going to give them a sign of who I have designated to be the actual priesthood of the families of Levi, which family will be the priests. And of course, it was the family of Aaron. So I'm in number 17. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and get from them a rod from each father's house, a symbol of authority, and all their leaders according to their father's houses, 12 rods. Write each man's name on the rod, and you shall write Aaron's name on the rod of Levi, for there shall be one rod for the head of each father's house. Then you shall place them in the tabernacle of meeting before the testimony where I meet with you. I'm in Numbers 17. And it shall be that the rod of the man whom I choose will blossom. Thus I will rid myself of the complaints of the children of Israel which they make against you. So Moses spoke to the children of Israel, and each of their leaders gave him a rod apiece. For each leader, according to their father's houses, 12 rods, and the rod of Aaron was among their rods. And Moses placed the rods before the Eternal in the tabernacle of witness. Now it came to pass on the next day that Moses went into the tabernacle of witness, and behold, the rod of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds, and produced blossoms, and yielded ripe almonds. Wow. So it was as if the tree were still, planted in the ground and producing. Now the word for almond is based upon the fact that the almond in Israel is the first major tree to blossom. The blossoming of the almond tree is the early beginning of spring. In Israel, we have the former rain, which comes after the autumn festival season, the winter heavy rains, and then we have lighter rain that comes in the spring, and in between we have around the Roman month of February. In the 11th month on the sacred calendar, the month of Shavat, we have the blossoming of the almond tree, and we have the 15th day of the 11th month is traditionally for the Jews the New Year of the trees. In other words, they figure tithing in ancient times when there was tithing done of the produce of the trees. The tithing went from the 15th of the 11th month to the next 15th of the 11th month. That was the year for the tithing on the produce of trees. And the initial blossoming is of the almond tree, so because it's the early blossom, it has that name of shakade. It's the let's say the word has to do with being diligent, being awake, being alert, being on the watch, and so it's interesting that it was the almond that budded there, and that's sort of indicative of the role of the priest as the one who has to be diligent, who has to be, maybe a bit more zealous than the rest to preserve the standards of the community. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But anyway, so it yielded ripe almonds, and I'm going to continue. Then Moses brought out all. Well, let me just, before I go any further, let me comment a little bit on the rods, or rather on the almonds. I want to go to Jeremiah and the first chapter, and here you see a play on words involving the almonds, as I'm saying here. So I want to go to Jeremiah, the first chapter. And in Jeremiah 1, I want to go to verse 11. And here he says to Jeremiah, "Moreover, the word of the Eternal came to me, saying, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I said, I see a branch of an almond tree. And then the Eternal said to me, you have seen well. I am ready to perform my word." So it's a play on words. He says, "I am diligent. I'm awake. I'm ready for action." Because Jeremiah, in his generation, is when the punishment came. So in the Hebrew, Jeremiah says, "Shaked," or "Shaked ani ro'eh." I see an almond tree. And so God said to him, "Ki shoked ani al devarai la soto." So he takes the word shaked for almond tree, and he says, "I am shoked. I am eager. I'm diligent to do what my words, or to do my is it plural? I think it's devari. To do my word." So you see the play on words there with the almond tree, and that ties in with what the priest's responsibility was going to be diligent, to be awake, alert, like a watchman. You see that term used regarding watchmen in Psalm 127, and I want to talk about the priests in Numbers 18. A couple of chapters after the 16th chapter of Numbers. We'll go now to Numbers 18. We see that there was indeed a covenant with the priests. There was an Aaronic covenant in Numbers 18 and verse 19. God says to Aaron, "All the heave offerings of the holy things which the children of Israel offered to the Eternal I have given to you and your sons and daughters with you as an ordinance forever. It is a covenant of salt forever before the Eternal with you and your descendants with you." And a covenant was made to the entire tribe of Levi. They had a special responsibility to be both the butchers and the teachers. They were to be involved. The priests particularly were to offer sacrifices. The Levites were going to assist them. So they would be part of the sacrificial rituals, but they also were involved in the music of the worship. So they were involved in that aspect of life, the musical aspect, and also they were involved in teaching. In fact, in Deuteronomy 33, you see a prophecy of what Moses had to say about the tribe of Levi, and I'm going to go to Deuteronomy 33 and verse 8. "And of Levi he said, let your Thummim and your Urim be with your Holy One, whom you tested at Massah and with whom you contended at the waters of Meribah, who says of his father and mother, I have not seen them, nor did he acknowledge his brothers, or know his own children, for they have observed my word and kept your covenant." In other words, these were people who focused on God and did not allow even family relationships to deter them from their commitment to the covenant. God came first in their lives. And so Moses says about Levi, "Bless his substance, Eternal, and accept the work of his hands. Strike the loins of those who rise against him, and of those who hate him, that they rise not again." So a special prayer for the survival of the Levites. And indeed they have survived, as I'll show you later. But I want to go now to the book of Malachi regarding the tribe of Levi. And in Malachi 2, as I said, the almond tree seems to symbolize what the Levites were supposed to be. Unfortunately, they didn't always adhere to this standard. In fact, Malachi condemns them here. Towards the end of the Old Testament period, we find corruption with Levi, and in the intertestamental period, unfortunately. But here's what God says. I'm in verse 4 of Malachi 2. Then you shall know that I have sent this commandment to you, that my covenant with Levi may continue, says the Lord of hosts. My covenant was with him, one of life and peace, and I gave them to him that he might fear me. So he feared me and was reverent before my name. The law of truth was in his mouth, and justice was found on his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity, and turned many away from iniquity. For the lips of a priest should keep knowledge, and people should seek the law from his mouth. For he is a messenger of the Eternal of hosts. And that's a play on Malachi. Malachi is my messenger, or it could be short for Malchiah, messenger of the Eternal. But then he goes on to say, but you have departed from the way. You have caused many to stumble at the law, and you have corrupted the covenant of Levi, says the Eternal of hosts. So unfortunately, like all of Israel, the Levites fell short. But nevertheless, that was their calling, and that was their responsibility. It's up to them to live up to it, but they can't escape it. So now I do want to go back to the to Numbers and finish that section there. So we see in number 16 that the rod of Aaron budded, as I read to you out of the book of Hebrews. And I'm sorry, did I say number 16? I want to go to number 17. So anyway, I'm going to go to verse 8. Now it came to pass on the next day that Moses went into the tabernacle of witness, and behold, the rod of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds, and had produced blossoms and yielded ripe almonds. Then Moses brought out all the rods from before the Eternal to all the children of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. So it was clear to the leadership which particular leader God had selected to be the ancestor of the priests. And the Eternal said to Moses, bring Aaron's rod back before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels, that you may put their complaints away from me, lest they die. So now they had no excuse, because the sign was there, and so that was a way of hopefully putting aside these complaints about who ought to be doing what. Thus did Moses, just as the Eternal had commanded him, so he did. So the children of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, surely we die, we perish, we all perish. So they still, unfortunately, didn't have a proper attitude about what had happened. It was their sinning that brought about these punishments. And if they had respected God's will, they wouldn't have had the trouble that they had. Whoever even comes near the tabernacle of the Eternal must die. Shall we also utterly die? Well, no, of course not. But unfortunately, they remained as the Bible says, a stiff-necked people. But they all died out in the wilderness, and then their offspring did fortunately follow Joshua positively, and did inherit the land. But God had made a commitment, to the Levites and to the priests, and that they would have a role to play historically, just as Israel as a whole has a role to play historically, just as the church has a role to play historically. Right now, it is the focus of God's work is in the spiritual Israel, those who are spiritual Jews, God's church, and they are the first fruits. And the time is going to come when Jesus Christ returns, and the first fruits will be resurrected, and they will be kings and priests in the millennium. And that is God's will. That's what He's decided, how He's decided to do it. That is His plan. And so those who are alive in the millennium will need to get with the plan, get with the program. I want to go to the book of James, the first chapter, and the 18th verse. James 1 and verse 18. Here he talks to the church and says, of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So this is God's plan as it's going to work out. And as I said, all of humankind will need to get in step with it. And in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 21, for since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. By man who is also God, Jesus Christ. And for as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive, but each one in his own order. Christ the first fruits, afterward those who are Christ at his coming. So the very first fruits, pictured by the Omer offering during the days of unleavened bread, is the resurrected Jesus Christ. And then the first fruits of the wheat harvest on Pentecost picture the church as the first fruits of humankind. And then we have God's plan unfolding, which the autumn festival days picture. And finally the eighth day pictures that final white throne judgment period. So as I said, God has his plan, and he's going to work out his plan. And we want to be careful about respecting, those who have responsibilities that they need to carry out, and we need to be careful about how we approach our whatever particular responsibilities we may have. For example, this is kind of a warning to me, because I was ordained into the ministry back in 1984, and it says here, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. And because for it says, for we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, also able to bridle the whole body. And then he goes into the power of speech, the power of the tongue, and how we have to be so careful, to keep the tongue under control. Now, without quoting a lot of verses, let me say that if we understand the history of God's church, I believe Jesus Christ intended to impact the world in a very powerful way, which he did, and to impact the world for the better, obviously. Of course, ultimately, he's going to save the world. But during this period of history, his church, the authentic church that he raised up, was not destined to run the world. It was destined to be a vulnerable minority, often subject to persecution. And speaking of seminars, I gave a seminar at the Festival of Tabernacles in Panama City Beach, and I told the audience there, if you were to think about God's church that he raised up, the Church of Jesus Christ, what I call Christian commandment keepers, the Bible characterizes that way in Revelation 12:17 and Revelation 14:12. A couple centuries ago, where was it? Where were the congregations of God's church? Who were the leadership? Who were the let's say the VIPs or the heroes of that church at that time? Could we name them? So we see that God's church was not in a condition to preserve the scriptures, not in a condition to preserve a calendar. So this had to be given to certain ethnic groups. And God had chosen Israel, and then what was left of Israel was Judah. And Judah was the Jewish people were the church to whom Jesus Christ came initially. He came as a Jew. He's going to be a Jew eternally. And so he came to a people that had the Holy Scriptures. And, of course, the Holy Scriptures, when you read them, it refers to certain months. Sometimes by name, sometimes by number. So if you're going to understand the scriptures, there's a calendar that goes with the scriptures. So the Jewish community preserved the Hebrew language as well as the Aramaic scriptures. The same alphabet is used for Hebrew or Aramaic. And And Aramaic is very much a part of Orthodox Jewish life. They study the Talmud, most of which is in Aramaic. They have Aramaic prayers in their liturgy. So we have the Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures, which the Jews have preserved, along with the calendar. On the other hand, we see in the New Testament to the Jew first and also to the Greek. The book of Revelation was written to the churches in Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Greek-speaking churches. We have 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, we have 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. The New Testament was written largely to Greek-speaking people. It was preserved in Greek. And so if we're going to, in other words, if we want to know what belongs in the Old Testament, go to the Hebrew-speaking world. And there's a calendar that goes with it, as I said. If you want to know what belongs in the New Testament, then you go to the Greek-speaking world. It would seem reasonable from the Bible, and just from I would think common sense, that would be the way it ought to be handled. And at the same time, God said that there would be priests available in the book of Jeremiah. God said there would be priests and Levites available through history, and indeed there have been. There's one speaking to you now. Among the Jews, they have preserved who are the priests, who are the Levites. There were ways that it was done, certain rules within the Jewish community to separate out the priests and the Levites. He also said that David would not lack a descendant to rule over Israel. And this means that there are descendants of David alive today. And in the Jewish community, there are some families, I believe, that traditionally believe they're descendants of David. There's also much more to that story that I'd like to cover at another time. But also think of it this way. Jesus Christ was resurrected to immortal life. The man, the son, the descendant of David, the carpenter's son, the rabbi, he was resurrected to immortal life, and he is in fact there waiting to inherit that throne, and he will return and inherit that throne. And so and also the people of Israel, who for the time being are not in that sense the focus of God's work at this time. When Jesus Christ returns and rules the world, then the nation of Israel will become once again the example that it should have been in ancient times. The first nation converted in mass when Jesus Christ returns will be Israel, and then Israel is located where Europe, Asia, and Africa come together, Mediterranean, the center of the world. So from there, the influence will spread, and we find in Isaiah 19 that Egypt and Assyria form a triple entente with Israel, and so the gospel message can spread from there. So God has a plan. He has made promises. He's made commitments, and he's going to see to it that his promises and commitments are going to be kept. And we need to be studying into those things, be very respectful of them, and be confident, very confident in them. And we can take confidence from the prophecies that have already been fulfilled about Jesus Christ's first coming, and we can also therefore be confident that what he promised to do in his second coming, in fact, he will do. So I do want to conclude by going to Isaiah 14, which I paraphrased earlier, and I want to, if my device will allow me, I want to quote from Isaiah 14 and verse 24. Isaiah 14 and verse 24. The Eternal of hosts has sworn, saying, surely as I have thought, so it shall come to pass. And as I have purposed, so it shall stand. All the best to you and yours.